Hi everyone, welcome to Wandering DMs. I'm Paul.
And I'm Dan. On this special episode of Wandering DMs, we have very special guest James Maliszewski of the famous Grognardia blog, who's back from a several-year hiatus and blogging. Blogging blitzkrieg is what he's been doing the last couple of weeks. James, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, in case anybody's watching this show and you don't know who James is or who Grognardia is, Grognardia is probably the most famous old school Renaissance gaming blog in existence. And James did go on hiatus starting in 2012, and you took 8-year hiatus, and many of us were eagerly anticipating the day if and when you might come back. You started blogging again last month. And I see that in the last 6 weeks, you have published 90 articles,
Wow.
which which I'm humbled by, because that's more than I've posted on my Delta's D&D hotspot in 2 years. So, by my estimation, along about you might need to pick it up, James, in order to by the end of this year exceed my output in those 8 years. I think you can do it, though. So I'm personally amazed. If anybody doesn't know, this is his blog is at grognardia.blogspot.com, and in the last month and a half or so, James, you have written game supplement reviews, pulp fantasy reviews. You've written about comics. You've had some really great interviews with people like Steve Jackson and Chris Holmes and Jeff Grubb and people like that. You've been rereading classic magazines like The General and RPGA newsletter, and then details on your 2 current role-playing campaigns that I figure we'll get into later. We are amazed. We have a lot of catching up to do in our reading, frankly.
Oh,
Yeah,
well,
sure.
I'm glad you're enjoying it.
Yeah,
It's really impressive.
so as William points out, Grognardia is how he found us. Of course, you're highly influential, I think, on both Dan and I, who started out blogging. Right, that's before we had this show. We were blogging around 2008 to 2010. I started somewhere in that window. I remember the days of getting the Grognardia bump when I think you linked to my article on the silent spell, and I was like, "Whoa, where'd all these hits come from?" I'm not surprised that some of our viewers have found us via you. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Oh, you're welcome.
And likewise, as I said before the show, and I guess I was going to mention at the end of the show, we've been producing our upcoming show, The Big Bad, our tournament D&D show, the last couple months. And one of the main reasons why that happened is that I got in a game here in Brooklyn playing your fairly famous Dwimmermount adventure. Happened to be playing with Stefan Picorni, the founder of Dwarven Forge, and that's the initial connection that we had to get their sponsorship to actually produce The Big Bad. So all our connections in our current show probably wouldn't be happening if you hadn't written Grognardia and published Dwimmermount. So we have to give an official The Big Bad thank you to James and Grognardia for that as well. So thank you.
I'm curious how
that's great.
Sorry, I'm curious how that came about, James. Actually, were you working with Stefan on that, or did Stefan just happen to show up to that game?
Now, James wasn't part of that. It was actually so maybe I might have misspoken there. Is James wasn't actually there. It was being run by somebody else.
Okay.
But many of us here in Brooklyn wanted to participate and wanted to see what his adventure looked like. So a bunch of us got together in a game store here in Brooklyn. James wasn't actually there, but in spirit he was, I would say.
Yeah, for sure.
So I got to ask James, how are you managing to output so much stuff? Are you actually writing your current articles on a day-by-day basis, or did you have a big backlog that you'd saved up for us all?
There were a few that were backlogs. When I decided to start writing again, I went back and looked through my draft file, and it turned out I actually had a fair number. So some of them, although not that many, were things I had. In a couple of cases, I think they were things I had written like back in 2009. So I just polished them up and decided to put them in. But the vast majority of the ones that I've done recently have all been new. they've just been things that have occurred to me that I've been thinking about for a while, and I wanted to post about.
Great. If you had to pick like the top 3 things that you had an itch to get off your chest in 2020, what was really on your mind that broke the dam for you to get back?
Well, what really broke the dam was the Swedish RPG Merkborg. That was what really broke the dam. A friend locally, he had a copy. He'd been singing its praises, saying what a weird, strange game it was. It's this bright neon yellow thing, and with this very strange artwork. And I figured, oh, what the heck? I'll buy a copy. And I read it, and I didn't like it at first. I'm still not entirely sure I like it, but it stuck with me, and I just felt like I had to write about it and talk about it, and I didn't know what. And I found myself slowly writing this this article, this review, this post about it, and I didn't know what to do with it. And he said, "Why don't you just post it to Grognardia?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Sure you could." He says, "Give people a thrill, see what would happen." And I did. And what happened was that apparently people liked it. And I was flooded by emails and people sending me screen caps of Facebook groups and all sorts. It really made an impact on people. Originally, I only intended it to just be a single one-off post. Partially, just I needed to do something with it. And partially, I have to admit, I wanted to see what would happen, see if anyone would notice. And apparently they did. So that encouraged me to start writing more. And next thing I knew, here we are.
We definitely saw that. Like I've been on, I check in on Twitter once or twice a day. And it, I think ever since middle of last month, there's been someone rediscovering the fact that you're writing again. So every day someone was like, "Did you know that James Maliszewski is writing on Grognardia again?" And 2 other people "What? Really? I did not. What the heck?"
Yes.
So yes. I've totally seen that.
There have clearly been waves of recognition. There was the initial bump that happened, and I think a lot of the people there came from Twitter, which is something I'm utterly unfamiliar with. But I think the Merkborg or Free League or someone like that must have done a post indicating that I had put up the review. So there was a huge bump then. And then I've noticed other ones over time. You just sort of look and I'll see suddenly there's this wave. So I'm guessing that it's the news is slowly percolating out. Mm-hmm. I get the impression, and maybe you could tell me more, that the blogging is kind of not as vibrant and it's not where a lot of the discussion is happening these days.
Paul might have, I don't know, Paul, if you, we've had a couple guests actually talk on that point in the last couple of months. Maybe, Paul, you have an opinion about that. I
think that's true, but it probably varies based on the sort of genre or corner of the hobby that you're in. Right, I think that blogging is still pretty popular in the old school circles, but there's this huge influx of folks playing 5th edition D&D, and I would say a lot of them are either on Twitter or Twitch, and that's a lot of that action is happening there.
I don't even know what either of those things are for the most part.
I'm kind of curious, James. I just want to hit back on a comment you made earlier because I'm curious if this is part of your sort of typical of your writing style or writing patterns, because it is for me, where I often say on my blog that I've written my blog entries just because I need to understand my own thoughts, and it's just the writing is this process for me to marshal my own thoughts, and then I'm like, I guess I might as well share it when I'm done. Is that typical of how you write, or is that just what happened in this one case?
It is quite typical of what I write. In fact, one of the interesting things that's happened as a result of writing recently is going back and rereading old posts that I had written a long time ago. And in some cases, I've changed my mind about things, or I didn't even know what my mind was, right? So it's the process of figuring out what I think about things. And I'm a very verbal kind of person, and since I can't speak to people all the time, writing is the way I do that. So yes, absolutely. That is exactly my process. It's that's me thinking out loud a lot of times. And sometimes I'm even trying to convince myself of something. So if I come across as being more strident or certain about something, then probably is warranted. That may be me trying to convince myself that such and such a thing is the case, or because I'd like it to be. Then it really is. But that's exactly right. What you described is completely accurate for my own writing as well.
That's super well put. Like, I find the same, and I find myself writing and then ending on a question about, like, well, here's like the options that I've come up with, but I don't know if anybody else has an opinion about which one is best. And I think we had one of our fellow YouTube, and I've forgotten who it was, a couple months, maybe Paul can remind me, who was talking about blogging is still probably best for long form writing, like I think you and also I and Paul do. Like if I'm on, it's funny because these media, they get shorter over time. Obviously, blogging is shorter than writing a book, as one would have to do at one point in order to publish. Twitter is really made for things about 100 characters long. Personally, if someone, is on Twitter and they have to post a chain of items, 20 chained items long, I don't like seeing things in that format myself. So for long form, thoughtful writing, I think that blogging is really still the best for that myself. I could be crazy.
No, I think you're right.
Yeah, that has been my experience too. I mean, that's the reason why blogging appealed to me in the first place, was just the ability to write at some length, but not super long things, little essays. And I think that's it's a good way to work things out, to try to encourage thought about something just for yourself, if not for other people. And what I really did used to like, and is slowly starting to happen now as I've begun posting again, comments, because people will say, well, actually, have you thought about this? Or, oh, I think this. Or they'll link, hey, this person said this such and such a thing. And then the next thing you know, there's a conversation going on. And that's really incredibly helpful, I find, for thinking about these matters.
I agree. The other thing I would say is, like, at least on mine, like, I like the fact that on my blog I have a little bit more control over those conversations, and if someone is rude or just not getting the tone of the platform, I can kind of take control and weed that out. Whereas on other platforms like Facebook or Twitter or something, like, you're kind of more at the mercy of the scrum of the platform, that you don't kind of have that control over. So I actually like, it's taken a number of years on mine, but I like the fact that I've curated the commenters on my blog, that we're all kind of like mind, and we're not having ridiculous arguments all the time.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, let's talk. Now, let me just come back to Morkborg. So I think you wrote your review on August 11th, and then you actually played a game later on. Is that right?
I did. I am in the midst of playing one right now. Yes.
Okay. How has your thought about that changed now that you've started playing it?
No, we've only played a few sessions, so it's hard for me to say. And the thing about it is, the game is very open-ended and stylized in the way that it presents its setting. So there's a lot of room for individual characterization. So I think the referee is putting his own personal style onto the tone to the thing. So I can't say. I am enjoying it a great deal. In fact, I was going to write something more about the combat system in it, which is a little different than D&D. It's interesting.
Great. Yeah, it's funny because actually you're taking me back to when I played Dwemermut. Actually, is the DM who was not James, was putting a very a different spin on it. And actually, when I later on got to read the book at Paul's house, because he actually has a hard copy of Dwemermut.
Yeah.
Actually, I was like, wow, there's a whole lot of things that were happening in that game that aren't actually part of the text. So depending on the DM, one can really take a thing and make it very different. So that's coming back to me as well about that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things actually about role-playing games generally, and particularly the sort of old school or traditional or whatever you want to call it end of things. It's encouraged, and I think people expect that to be the case. I'm always very fascinated to hear about other people's takes on not just settings that I know, but even ones that I don't, that they've decided to make them their own. And it's I don't know, I find that very enjoyable to know this. We always played it this way. It's like, oh, I never heard of that before, and so forth. It's a fascinating joy. It's a discovery to find out how other people take something that you're familiar with and then run with it in a different direction.
Right.
You know, I've been working on this this metaphor. Let me try it out on you guys. Maybe because Dan and I've been spending so much time in video editing recently. But for me, writing RPG material, publishing an adventure or whatnot, I find is very much like, say, being the director of a shoot, knowing that you're just gathering all the pieces and you're going to send them off to the editor, who is the DM, and they're going to assemble a final product, and you don't actually know what that final product looks like, and so you're just trying to arm them with as many good bits as possible, but that the actual end product is really in the hands of the editor to come up with something that's amazing and delightful, and might be different from one editor to the next.
Oh, definitely. Although the thing is, it's not just the editor, too. I mean, I know very well that the players bring things to it that I don't expect as well. I mean, in all
That's
the
true.
games that I have run, I'm most happy, actually, to be honest, when the players completely surprise me and do something I'm not expecting.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Totally.
that's in our queue, Dan, right? That's in our queue for topics. We were going to do a whole show about blowing up your campaign, right? I think that's...
Yes.
We've all experienced this wonderful moment where we're running a game and it just goes so off the rails that the DM says,
Oh, yes.
I need 5 minutes. Everybody go take a break. I need to figure out what happens next because I have no idea.
Yeah, I think we agree that we love that, and sometimes in gaming nowadays there's still this debate about, am I writing a story or not? And certainly for my purposes, I enjoy being surprised and not knowing the story in advance. So I think the three of us are pretty like-minded on that, I believe.
Well, I always like to say the referee is a player, too. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's important to remember that the game master is as much a player as the actual people controlling the characters, and they deserve to be surprised and delighted from time to time by the way things turn out. You don't know what's going to happen.
I've kind of resisted that thesis for a while, but the current vote on this show is 2 versus 1 against. So if both Paul Siegel and James Malashevsky both say almost the exact same words on that topic, I guess I'm going to say that you win on that one, you guys.
The guys over at Fear of a Black Dragon have even gone so far as to say that not only is the DM a player, but as DM you must therefore defend your fun. Right, that you still have to have fun at the table, and if you are exerting yourself so much to provide fun for everyone else that you are no longer having fun, that you're now doing it wrong, and you need to check that.
Interesting.
That's a strong way of saying it, but
Yeah.
I was going to say it's a strong way of saying it, but I do agree. I think that's true. I mean, I know when I've run campaigns and you get to the point where you're not enjoying it as the referee anymore, it affects the enjoyment of everyone, and so you do need to make sure that you're getting something out of it as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Yeah,
it's a solid argument. It's a strong. It is ultimately a hobby and an entertainment, and it should be nourishing to us and not taxing.
Yeah,
that's certainly true. So I think I want to dig into this idea of taking a pre-written campaign material and putting your own twist on it. And of course, some people stick purely to they handcrafted the campaign, the world, the characters, everything is totally custom. Some people stick to that, but some of us do like to take a world that has a larger number of players and maybe more recognition, and put our own twist with that. So I know that, James, one setting that you've played in for quite a long time is Professor Barker's Empire of the Petal Throne, or Tekumel world, and I think I read that you have had a weekly game in that for the last 5 or 6 years, since 2015, I think.
That's correct. Yes.
That's really dedicated.
That's a long-running game.
It is. And I've just been very fortunate because I have players who are capable of sticking with it. That their life situation is such that there's not a lot of disruption. I should say that it started in March of 2015, but I think because of various things, it's probably about twice every 3 weeks equivalent. It's theoretically weekly, but things come up that prevent its happening. But the group originally was 6 players. Now it's 8, and I only like to run if I have a certain quorum of players to continue. So now that we've got 8, it's a lot easier to do that, so we haven't been missing as much as when there were only 6. But yeah, it's been absolutely terrific. It's an amazing campaign, and I can't see it's ending anytime soon. I mean, really, I think as long as everyone continues to show up, it's going to keep going.
Now, can I ask just a quick technical question? Are you playing with 8 people online, or are you playing in person? So, is 8 people all connected together? Is there anything you do in particular to run a game online with 8 players? Because that seems like a lot to me for an online setting. I know that a lot of old school stuff, we like bigger play groups, but when you're online and you have to, only one person can speak at a time, I think it gets a little harder.
It's interesting. I think Dan would be fascinated by this in particular. The larger the group, the more that certain older practices start to re-emerge. There starts to be a caller, for example.
Yep.
It starts to occur that when you have a large enough group of people, someone will step up or be just designated as the official, not official, but the caller. Everyone will look to them and let them be the interface. In my particular campaign, in this Empire of the Petal Throne campaign, there are actually like 2 or 3 sort of callers, depending what the circumstances are. Because we have one player who's very knowledgeable about, say, the setting, for example. And so when certain matters come up that delve deeply, I guess, into the lore of the setting, he's the one who often will be the interface. They have another player who really enjoys combat, and his character is geared toward that. So, and then another player who enjoys sort of the social interactions and the machinations and intrigue, and so he tends to step up. And that's the way these things go. But it is really very fascinating to see that those practices from 40 years ago, they weren't merely artificial. They were the kind of thing that happened naturally.
Fascinating. Did you know that going in, or was that something you discovered along the way?
It's just something we discovered along the way. Initially, I just wanted to play EPT. That was all I wanted to do, and I had no intention of. There was nothing more to it than simply wanting to play the game and explore the setting a little bit, because I'd never really had an opportunity to do it for any length of time. I had played before, but not for any length of time, and I just wanted to have a chance to do that. So it is incredible watching all these things re-emerge. It's
cool.
It's fascinating.
Cool. And has that game always been online, or did you adapt to online when the pandemic hit?
No, it was always online, partially because a lot of my players are in Europe, and they're sort of scattered all across the globe, so we're in different time zones. Yep. So as a result, it was much easier to do it that way.
Great. That's
great. Fascinating. I gotta process that. But for those of us that aren't, those of us who aren't Tekumel experts, what is your elevator pitch for that campaign setting, which most of us just know? Like, I know Tekumel is like, it's some kind of complicated, elaborate thing. It might be just the first 2 words that spring to mind. So what is Tekumel about, and what attracted you to it that you felt like you need to play in it?
Gee, this is a complicated thing for me, just because I have a long history of being a fan of the setting. But I guess if I had to do a sort of a brief précis of the thing, I would say it is a science fantasy setting. It is a science fiction setting that has a fantasy overlay. I mean, the premise being that there's this planet in the very far future that's been colonized by human beings, then something happens that casts it into a pocket universe where the laws of reality change somewhat, and what we would consider to be magic is possible. And likewise, powerful beings that to human beings might as well be gods exist. And so there's this sort of substrate of science fiction in the past. It's kind of, it feels a bit like a Sword and Planet setting, really. So it reminds me a bit of John Carter of Mars and those kinds of things. But it does have very elaborate sort of social structures, partially because Professor Barker wanted something that was. The story goes, he started to play D&D very, very early at the University of Minnesota, and when he did, he liked the game, but his immediate response was, well, what's the society like? What's the world like outside the dungeon? And so he had been developing the setting since he was a child, and he figured, oh, wait, maybe I could do this. And he had done it. So he'd been thinking about it for a long time, and it's informed by his own interest in like ancient Egypt and Central America and the natives of Central America and South America, as well as his time in India and Pakistan and places like that. So it has a distinctly non-Western European feel to it, which is a great thing if you are willing to accept that kind of difference. But for some people, it's a little hard to initially get over because it's unfamiliar. You can't just sort of say, he's a knight, or this is an elf or something. There's an extra level of explanation that's required. But once you get into it, you find that it's really not that different from any other RPG, fantasy RPG.
Great, fascinating. So your campaign is called the House of Worms, I think, and yes. Occasionally you post recent play update reports, and I think you're about to hit session 200. I believe you are about to hit session 200 with that. What I saw.
That's right.
And you also publish a zine about adventuring in Tekumel called The Excellent Traveling Volume, and I think we have an image of the Excellent Traveling Volume. And I think that you've been publishing this since 2012, I think, I'm guessing maybe.
It came out in 2014.
Okay, 2014, great. And
was the first one.
It seems like you publish like 1 or 2 volumes a year is what I saw. Is that about right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's about right. There was the 12th issue just came out in August.
Cool. And so we'll put a link in our description, and for anybody listening to this in podcast, the website for James' zine on Tekumel is tetvzine.com. So the volume is The Excellent Traveling Volume. So it's tetvzine.com is where you can go to find that. Is that print only, James?
It was initially print only.
Okay.
That was sort of it was part of why I did it as well. I wanted to get that kind of experience of doing it that way. But in recent years, you can get PDFs through Drive-Thru RPG. So it is available electronically as well. But I prefer people to buy it print just because I think you get a better experience of what it's like. I mean, that was part of the reason. I missed zines for the most part when I was a younger gamer. Like, there were things I was dimly aware of, but I never really had much to do with them. So I wanted to see what that whole thing was like, and it's very fascinating. It's a part of the hobby that often people don't remember, or they don't have any experience with themselves. So it seems to have been a bit of a resurgence in recent years.
I guess we should talk about that. I guess so. Is The Excellent Traveling Volume? Are all the articles written by you, or do you get some stuff by other people in there?
Sadly, they are almost all written by me. I wish I got other people. From time to time, I do get submissions, but it's hard because Tekumel is one of those settings that if you don't know it, it's hard. You can't write anything for it. And a lot of the fans, they're very reverential toward the material that already exists. So they're somewhat reluctant to sort of go off the edges of the map, so to speak, and make their own material. They seem to like what I've done, which I'm very glad of, but I wish they would be a little more adventurous and willing to come up with new things. And so that's part of the problem in doing that. But yes, in answer to the question, I've written probably about 90% of all the material that's appeared.
I totally agree that I also totally missed zine culture back in the day entirely, and like I was barely even aware of it. I guess I'd hear the phrase once in a while. Sometimes I wonder if that's like my geographical issue of me growing up in a really rural part of Maine, and I mean, frankly, before I ordered it, nobody had even heard of Dungeons and Dragons when I was growing up. Like, I was the one that introduced everybody to that. Oh. Did you grow up in a rural area or a city?
No. I grew up in the suburbs outside of Baltimore. So there was a very strong RPG and wargaming culture because of Avalon Hill, and plus all the various military installations and things like that in the area. So no, not at all.
Gotcha. So maybe you had just a little bit more even awareness about it than I would, because there wasn't anybody even around to even talk about it to me. Paul, did you get any zines in the day?
I never even heard the word until the last few years. Had no knowledge of it. Interestingly, I think the story game scene is fairly heavy into zines. I know that the Gauntlet produces a zine, and or probably a couple of zines. So the funny thing is too, I always end up asking, like, well, what defines a zine? Because I hear them sometimes talking about role playing games published in zine format, and I'm like, what exactly does that? Is it just booklet? Like what?
I guess, but there are zines come in all sorts of formats. That's the thing, right? I mean, there are electronic only zines. That's a really good question. I wish I had a really good answer.
Yeah. I'm guessing it's more about like just the sort of home, the scratch built, the sort of DIY attitude, right? Although I think with modern sort of digital publishing, the line between that and something professional is just so blurred at this point. It maybe is hard to say.
It is true. Yeah,
you almost have to intentionally make it look old school.
Yeah.
You have to go out of your way to do that now, actually.
Which some people do. Some people do that. I opted not to go that route. I wanted it to look as good as it possibly could. But I do understand that sort of aesthetic decision to the preference for making it look like it was back in 1978 or whatever.
I like that. I like it. Paul William has a comment there that I kind of like, talking about the fact that he knew zines through the music band scene, and there's a lot of interesting connections sometime between music subculture and gaming subculture, particularly in the 70s and 80s. And obviously, there's more than one publishing house actually that's OSR publishing that's also committed to using themes from music and heavy metal and things like that, and certainly Lamentations of the Flame Princess would be one, I suppose. So there's a lot of interesting connections. Yeah. There you go. I guess that's why I was in my head, right? So for you, James, I think you were kind of rediscovering something or scratching an itch that you didn't get to at the time. Do you think there's any broader trends that are making zines resurgent these days? Why do you think that is now?
I honestly, that's a good question. I don't know. See, the thing is, what I've noticed when I first became aware of zines being more popular, it was Dungeon Crawl Classics, actually. Goodman Games has really encouraged and promoted lots of zines being published. If you go to their website, they have tons of zines, and there's something about DCC that has encouraged that. And I think it's partially a kind of aesthetic cultural thing, a kind of nostalgia for what that was, what it was like in the sort of 70s. They've really hung their hat, I guess, on that, and that's what did it. But I wish I knew. I really wish I knew. I think maybe it just has something to do with people starting to marshal the technology that's available now. Like, it is now quite possible for one person or a small number of people to make something that would have taken a lot of effort in the past. And it's a way to sort of get things out there in smaller numbers that you don't need a company in order to be able to do that. And I think people enjoy that freedom.
I have a theory to propose to you, Dan, which is that one of the nice things about zine, especially that sort of booklet format zine that looks like it was maybe produced on someone's home printer, is that the technology now is such that it's easy to produce that internationally, right? The internet has kind of connected us all, so now your audience is not just, the Eastern U.S., right? It's the whole world. And if I'm in Germany and I want an American zine, I could buy the PDF, print it out on my own printer, staple it together, and it probably looks as good as intended, right? The quality bar is exactly what was imagined.
I accept that. I accept that thesis, Paul. Theory. That's a pretty good. And I mean that's there are pains and there are joys of the internet, but certainly that's the joy of the internet, is to be able to connect with maybe a niche interest, maybe a subculture around the world, and not quite be so isolated as some of us were when we were young or teenagers or something like that.
I mean, I think the fact is that people ultimately still do prefer print to digital copies where it's possible.
Yeah.
And so this is a mechanism whereby I don't have to incur the expense of a lot of high-end printing, but I can still have a physical thing in my hands. Yeah.
And I'll say the digest form, actually, which is how original D&D and games like Traveller that we'll get to in a little bit came. And certainly I actually format all of my gaming materials and all of my products in digest form specifically so someone can print it home with a standard printer, just throw a staple to the middle and basically have a book that looks as good as what we had to start with. Yeah. So there's a lot. I personally really like the digest form. Plus, I mean, I don't know if anybody does this anymore, but on my tablet, right, it's perfectly sized for one page on my tablet at a time too. So I also do a lot of cutting. Like I have a cutting board here where I'm slicing stuff in half a lot. But there's a lot of advantages to the digest form precisely because of that.
I think it's less common in the more modern stuff. Like if you go into DM's Guild and you buy a bunch of PDFs, the stuff I've put up there, I always try to make sure, like I have a nice looking version, but I also try to make sure there's one with as much like background textures and stuff removed that is printable, right? If you want to print it out, here's the printable PDF. I don't think a lot of folks do that anymore. I feel like that's less frequent. That they're assuming you're just going to look at it on your tablet, and that's the end of the story.
Good point. Good point. Now, James, you put stuff on Drive-Thru-RPG, am I right?
Yes, there are a few things. They're mostly, the Excellent Traveling volume is there now, and then my science fiction RPG, Thousand Suns.
Okay. Sorry, we lost audio there for a second, but I think it should be fixed now.
Okay.
It happened when we cut to the Thousand Suns picture. So just when I cut that in, we lost audio. Sorry, everyone.
So yeah, I'll just fill in. So if we went blank for a little while, Thousand Suns is James' personal sci-fi role-playing system that is on Drive-Thru-RPG. And we were just saying that it's a nice self-contained volume. Everything you need to run a sci-fi campaign, kind of in one nice book, without a lot of the bloat that I guess companies have to wrestle with the business versus the art, right? It's like for me, I like having this compact volume, but then if it's going to be an ongoing business concern, people have to find reasons to make supplements, like you just said, James. So. Yes. Let's talk about other sci-fi. So I think you've played Traveller. Am I right?
Oh yes, I've played Traveller. Traveller is. I always say that D&D was my first love, but Traveller was my true love. I started playing D&D like most people did, but when I discovered Traveller, I fell in love with it, and it's always been my number one RPG. I love it to death. And I just concluded a 2.5-year campaign that I've been playing with Traveler. Again, it was all online. So yeah, Traveler is something I know a great deal about.
I think I was being a little sly there because, of course, I've seen your updates and your really nice maps to what I think you call your Rafeus sector. Was your 2-year campaign there? And the other thing I thought was really interesting is one of the articles you've written in the last couple of weeks is you wrote an article specifically about the original Traveler book, and you called it the perfect role-playing game book. Why do you think that the original Traveler book is the perfect book ever written?
Because much like what I was hoping to do with Thousand Suns, you really don't need anything else. If you have that rule book, and it's like 176 pages or something like that, it's pretty much everything you could possibly ever need as a referee or as a player. And the great thing is it's not just rules, but it also provides lots of examples, sample adventures, NPCs, some setting information. It's a terrific sort of introductory but complete game. So if you've never played an RPG or Traveler, you could use it. But if you are familiar with it, you could also use it. It's geared toward all ranges of experience and all levels of familiarity with Traveler and science fiction generally. So it's a really great book, and you can get that for like $20, I think, a reprint of it on a hardcover. Not a hard. Yeah, is it? Yes, it is hardcover through Drive-Thru.
Nice. I think that there was. It's interesting that I think there was a window, maybe about 10 years ago, where a lot of these classic products were not available unless you wanted to hunt them down on a collector's basis and pay maybe hundreds of dollars for them. And so I think, like I could be crazy, but I think a lot, like some of the OSR production was actually to fill in these lacuna of games that we wanted to share with other people, but weren't actually in publication. So it's an interesting pivot that's happened in the last, 5-6 years or so, that these things were released by the companies that own them, and you can get them online and share them more widely. I who knows whether that will continue, actually, because at some point, Wizards had the original Little Brown books for D&D online, and then they went away at one point, and then they came back. And, I don't know what their licensing deal is with Drive-Thru RPG, but, it's not 100% sure that they'll always be available in that format. So it's nice that it's there now.
Yes.
Let me see. So I haven't played Traveler, but I will say this. I always hear... I was actually looking at it like a couple weeks ago. And I was looking at the original Traveler book a couple weeks ago because I always hear about the interesting mini-game around player character creation in which there's a certain amount of risk. So what I saw was as you proceed through your academy or through your training, every year or so, you make a decision about which path to take next. One is safer and one is riskier, and it can result in your character actually dying in character generation before you actually ever play with it. So I kind of wanted to actually do that with my standard play group and actually see what their take is on a game so deadly that you might die before you play. Have you seen that happen, James? How common is it for that bit to happen? Yeah.
Very common if you're playing a scout. It's a profession, that's a very dangerous profession. Traveler's fascinating. This character generation minigame, as you described it, in that it lays out all these different professions, primarily military, because that was sort of the structure of it, and you can see in advance, what the likelihood of survival, promotion, getting certain kinds of skills are. And so the way the game, I guess, what was intended is that the more valuable, the more, like if you want to become a pilot, for example, certain kinds of skills are very useful, as well as certain kinds of rewards, like getting a starship to start with. That's harder, which means that if you want to create a character who has that, you have to enter into these higher risk categories, and you're less likely to get them. I have a computer program, actually, that I sometimes just play idly, which is the character generation minigame. And it's so much fun, right? Because you just try to go through, and then your character dies, like, okay, fine, I'll start another one. And it's very enjoyable. It's quite a fun little thing. I mean, Traveller has whole bunches of these little mini games where you roll things up randomly and you wind up with something you don't know. Like, you don't really know even if you choose, okay, my character's going into the Marines or the Navy or something, you don't know who he will be until the end. It's like, oh, I guess he was mostly a desk sergeant or something because he has all these levels in administration or whatever. Which is interesting because you can wind up with a character you don't expect. So it is fun. And that's one of the most appealing parts of Traveller, actually, all these little mini games that you can play.
It's interesting because a lot of old school games. So obviously D&D, the original D&D is written that you just randomly roll the 6 abilities, and then you should probably choose your race and class depending on what appeared to you. And Paul and I think both appreciate discovering who the character is when we sit down, not coming with a pre-made idea pre-scripted idea in our heads, but discovering who we're going to play on the fly. And some old superhero games do the same thing of purely random nature. Now, as opposed to there are people younger than ourselves who are pretty committed to, I'm going to have a fully fleshed out character, I'm going to write maybe a complicated backstory of my own design and come to the table with that. But one of the things I like about the Traveller offer, and I think one of the things that for me is magical about role-playing games, is the interface between my limited creativity and the random dice telling me whether I was right about that or not. So one of the things that really attracts me about Traveller is that it is, as we're saying, a mini game of there are some decisions to be made, but there are some dice to be rolled, and it's really the interface of that really kind of makes it magical. So not having played through that, it seems very attractive to me, actually. It's a smart way of doing character generation. I wonder why more games don't do that.
I don't know. Traveller is interesting. It has been influential in some ways over subsequent RPG design, but not others. Like GURPS, for example, has tech levels that come from Traveller ultimately. That's just one example. That's such a minor thing in Traveller, but like the actual sort of core of creating your character randomly in this sort of life path sort of way, that doesn't seem to have been picked up by many other subsequent game designs, as far as I can recall.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. It seems really attractive to have its own mini game there. I guess we got to think about that more. Now, I suppose, okay, so we've talked Tekumel and we've talked Traveller, and for me, kind of being a TSR zombie, I played Star Frontiers more myself. I guess it would really be dumb on our part to have you on, James, and not ever talk about D&D specifically, which I'm realizing we were about to happen. So there's a really interesting question from John Miller in our chat. I don't know if you can pull that up.
Yeah, Paul. Which one do you want, Dan?
The one about what rule set for D&D.
Yeah, sure. So John is asking, what rule set do you currently use or prefer for your D&D games?
That's a good question. I have often, and most often, used just the original D&D. I just used the 3 little brown books plus supplements, varying bits of supplements. But right now, I ran a D&D game a couple of weeks ago, just sort of it was like a 3 or 4 session thing, and I used Old School Essentials. Do you know that thing? Necrotic Gnome, I think. Gavin Norman is the designer. And I think, again, Dan, you would appreciate this because he spent a long time combing through, in this case, basic and expert D&D, not original D&D, and trying to see where there were things that hadn't been covered or had been explained less clearly or implied various things that were never outright stated. And he's not rationalizing it so much, but just sort of codifying it in a way that's much more accessible to people. And it's a really nice little rule set. It's the best part about it is how it's presented. It's just presented in a very, very clear way in the rule books so that you can understand everything just by glancing at it, rather than it's a brilliant. I wish I could do it justice. It's just the organization and presentation is remarkable, and I'm very impressed with it. But original D&D is sort of my favorite edition, like the old Three Little Brown Books.
Yeah, I feel like the organization and refinement aspect of the Moldvay Cook edition of Basic is something that Dan and I are always praising, and then maybe we waffle a bit between that and the original LBBs. So I totally hear that. Let me just pop in John's follow-up question, because I think it's interesting here. Of have you taken any rules from Empire of the Petal Throne and used them in your D&D games? And I wanted to bring this up because now I'm actually confused, because I guess I was assuming Empire of the Petal Throne was a setting for D&D, but is it its own rule set? It's its own set?
It is, yes. It is its own rule set that is clearly derivative of original Dungeons & Dragons, but it has its own character classes. It only has 3 of them, so it's like original D&D. In fact, the very same 3. And it is the first game to introduce critical hits, for example.
Okay.
And spell casting is not guaranteed. You have to make a percentage roll to see if you succeed at it. It's percentile based rather than 3d6 for like ability scores and things like that. But as to the question, no, I actually have not introduced anything into it specifically, though there is one rule I wanted to, which is that in Empire of the Petal Throne, you reroll your hit points every time you gain a level. So if you have, 1d6 plus 1 for being a warrior at first level, and then you get your 2d6 at second level, you roll 2d6, and only if that result is higher than what you had for your previous level do you actually get more hit points. And I actually like that because over time it helps you if you had poor rolls at low levels, you can get a bump, and then if you've already got really good rolls, you're not going to advance quite as much. And the hit point inflation, it levels things out in the end. It makes it a more sort of even thing. I've never used it, but I have thought about using it many times in D&D.
So I actually did use that in a 5th edition campaign that I was playing for a little while. The players wanted that, especially, the notion being, especially if you're playing a D10 or D12 hit die character and you have 2 or 3 levels of rolling a 1, then you're like, this isn't what I signed up for, right? I thought I was going to be a big beefy warrior, and I just can't get the dice to do what I want. It's interesting. I think we ended up giving up on it simply because not all the players at the table could always keep in their head what the mechanic was for some reason. That they were always confused. I'm leveling up. Now tell me again, what am I supposed to do? I got to re-roll everything. I don't know why. It seems straightforward, but...
That is one of the problems of D&D. It is sort of like the language that everyone understands. Even people who don't play D&D, they've internalized these rules. So when it's like, no, we do it this way. And it's like, but no, what? It's hard to keep this keep it in your head because it's sort of just like the basic language of role playing that most people understand.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I never thought of that rule until recently, but I think I've discovered that like a surprising number of people interpret original D&D with that rule. And one thing I would point to is that the original texts, original D&D, AD&D, the class listing actually lists the full hit dice per level. So let's take an example. So for a 4th level fighter, what's actually listed in the table is 4d8. In one version, right? Yes. And whereas nowadays they converted the expression of that to you get an extra d8 per level. So just looking at the table with very sketchy explanations like they had in original D&D, that's a totally legitimate interpretation. If I get 4th level, I'm supposed to roll 4d8 apparently, because that's actually what it says right there. Paul's probably in 5th edition, they don't have the tables set up like that, I don't think. So I can see why that's a harder interpretation to come up to with maybe.
I think James has a really good point of just you get so used to. You're talking about a group that's been playing this game for 20 years, right? They're just so used to the old way that like they can't keep it in their heads that how do I do this again? I reroll everything.
And I'm prone to making a mistake like like clearly we're all familiar with the debate that happened on John Peterson's blog in 2014 in March, right? With person A and person B hashed out at these points, and clearly I assume that we're all knowledgeable about the points of this argument, and therefore we should do it this way, right? And I'm always wrong about that.
I was only going to add that one of the other interesting things about Empire of the Petal Throne as a rule set is that precisely for this reason, it was written after Professor Barker had played original D&D at the University of Minnesota, their gaming club, and that he went home over the Christmas break, and he, in a flurry of energy, wrote the whole thing in, like, of course, like 2 weeks. And the way it presents the rules in some cases are based on the interpretations of what original D&D was like. So it's quite possible that hit point rolling was what they did at the time, how they read the texts at the University of Minnesota in late 74 or whenever it was. So it's, as a historical document, it's fascinating too, just to look at it that way.
Yeah. You know, it's funny what you just said about, and that was completely news to me, about Professor Barker writing a campaign in one sudden flurry, because it's very reminiscent to what we had Dave McGarry tell us in one of his presentations a couple years ago, actually, that the famous Dungeon board game was just written in one weekend, was entirely written in about 36 hours in one weekend. I guess he was coming off like a bad relationship breakup or something like that. And it's fascinating to think about this sudden emergency creative nova go off. And then, you know, and it's wonderful, and I will still play it today. And there have been, you know, different editions of the Dungeon game and different iterations, but frankly, they don't, over 30 or 40 years, they don't amount to as much output or differences than in that particular just one weekend. So it's funny how many examples of that there are, that these things just, they didn't exist, and then all of a sudden there was one day where they needed to exist in the world, and then it happened all at once.
It's a bit like writing 90 blog posts in a week, it sounds like.
It wasn't in a week. It wasn't in a week.
No, sorry. That was mostly me giving a jab there at Dan, which I succeeded.
Well, it's an amazing. Nonetheless, it's been an amazing return to form, James, and some of us need to pick up our reading pace and also our writing pace, because we've been massively humbled by your own creative output. So you're very much in the same tier as a McGarry or a Barker, with in your case your blogging and writing.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind.
Are you playing much D&D these days, James, or is it all as Empire, Petal Thrones, and
no?
Traveler
I'm not playing D&D at all right now, actually. I'm playing a lot of games, though. I'm trying to think. Let's see. There is Empire of the Petal Throne, which I'm refereeing. I'm playing in a Merkborg game. I had been playing RuneQuest until fairly recently. I also am playing Forbidden Lands. I don't know if you know that game. It's a Swedish RPG. Oh, another Swedish RPG. And it's a sort of hex crawl fantasy game produced by Free League is the name of it. And I've been playing that for about a year now, and that's a lot of fun too. It's awesome. But no D&D. No, it's true.
I think that, if I'm not wrong, I think you interviewed Eric Grandstrom, who's the designer of that, or did I mix that up?
I did. No, I did. I did indeed.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
When you do your interviews, do you do those by voice chat with people, or do you send them?
No, they're all by email. They're all by email, because I find it makes things a lot easier, because I can do follow-ups and easily sort of just interpolate them into the course of the interview of the questions. And plus, a lot of the people that I interview are older, and it's easier to have them just do little short emails here and there back and forth. They find it much more, it's just simpler to do rather than sort of scheduling a time to sit down and talk or whatever. And it saves me trouble too, because I don't have to transcribe anything. It's already in text form.
That makes sense. I think it fits the tone of your blog of one that's literate and verbal and well written, and so I think that doing them in writing certainly is in the tone of your blog. So I think it certainly fits there. So I've really enjoyed those interviews myself.
Good. I've got a couple more interesting. I think again, Dan. I think there's one coming up you will like based on a supplement to a game that you enjoy and speak very highly of.
You're really good at the promotional game, James. We might need to get you on board because I'm intrigued. I don't know what it is, but I'm super intrigued.
No. There's a game that you have mentioned this very interview and this very show, and there's a supplement for it that I know you like, and the designer of it is talking with me right now. Well, not immediately, but we're exchanging emails, so it's coming up.
Okay.
Great.
Okay. I have a vague guess. Did this person write adventures for basic D&D once in a while?
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
Okay, wow. Well, now I'm really eager to see that. I'm so glad. I'm glad you're doing that. That's great, man. Yeah, he's great. Did you know that, Paul? Did you know that he's really awesome at this?
so it would seem. Excellent. Well, we are about out of time. James, is there any last thoughts you want to leave our viewers with, or anything that we didn't get to cover?
No, I don't think so. You did a very good job. Thank you.
Great. Viewers, if you have any thoughts on the resurgence of Grognardia, burning questions that we didn't get to that you wish James had answered, leave them in the comments below, and maybe we'll endeavor to get James back someday in the future.
Sure,
that would be great if we can. I think we've just barely scratched the surface on his recent output, so I would personally love that if we could. To our and possibly new viewers this week, tuning into our interview with James Maliszewski. Remember that you can like, follow, and subscribe to us on YouTube and Twitter and Twitch and also Facebook. We do have the handle Wandering DMs, all one word, on all of those sites.
Indeed. You can also listen to this show in podcast-only format, in audio-only podcast format, if you prefer. You can find that at our website at wanderingdms.com or on various podcast carriers such as iTunes and Spotify and etc. If you are listening to us on one of those sites, please take a moment to rate and review us. That helps us out a lot.
It definitely does. As usual, we really have to thank our patrons who support the show, that give us the time and resources to get in touch with really great guests like James here today. If you would like to join our patrons in supporting Wandering DMs, you can go to patreon.com/wanderingdms, and we would really appreciate that support. We have a whole lot of projects with Wandering DMs that we are rolling out in the near couple of weeks. Look for the Dev Diary show on Tuesday on our production of The Big Bad, our old school / mashup new school tournament D&D production.
Dan, I heard there was going to be something really big on that this coming Tuesday. Is that right?
A little bird did tell me that we are releasing one of the biggest looks at what the show actually looks like to date. I think on Tuesday at 8. Excellent. On the Dev Diary here. Thank you for reminding me about that. Yeah. Paul has a live play Warhammer D&D mashup that happens Thursday from 8 to 10, right before Critical Role. If you want to tune to that, is fantastic. Our subscriber drive for YouTube subscribers ends today. So actually today, if you're listening to this live, is your last chance to go to wanderingdms.com, make about 4 clicks. You'll wind up subscribing on YouTube if you haven't before, and you'll be in the running for a prize package of everything that Paul and I have ever developed for Wandering DMs, and also under our own title. So do that today if you haven't done that. Tell a friend, share the prize package if you get it, and we would enjoy you getting notifications for our upcoming shows as well. I had to forget something, Paul.
Yeah. You did a good job there, Dan. Did a good job. Thank you. I'm glad. Yeah, please do that. Our subscription drive ends at midnight tonight. So if you want to enter in for those awesome prizes, please make sure you do that soon.
And probably more important is that you'll be getting notifications about our upcoming tournament D&D show with a lot of celebrity guests playing through it when we release that in a couple weeks. And again, Tuesday night is where we debrief and do our weekly therapy session about all the work we're doing for that. But don't forget to visit Grognardia, because James is producing so much fascinating content. And if you, I don't know how you missed what that is, but if you don't want to know what that is, again, it's grognardia.blogspot.com, and you can see all the amazing things that many of us are catching up on reading that James is producing, as well as his zine at tetvzine.com for Tekumel, as well as his products on Drive-Thru-RPG, as well as his podcast. We didn't even get to that, James. Where do people go for your podcast?
It's tekumelpodcast.com, I believe. It's called The Hall of Blue Illumination.
Great.
So look for that, and we'll be looking forward to a lot more writings from James and more products about Tekumel and science fiction and D&D and all kinds of things like that. So James, once again, thank you so much for joining us on Wandering DMs, and we hope we can get you back sometime another time.
I would love it. This was very enjoyable. Thank you.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So don't forget, of course, we have the talk show here every Sunday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, live on YouTube and Twitch. So we hope that if you're watching right now, you will join us next week for another thought-provoking discussion.
We'll see you then.